All right. So, so what we're going to do is review a metabolic test that I had done. Um, Thanks to Tanner putting me through the paces, and let's talk about the results. Okay. So, for those of you that don't know us, my name is Aaron Shaw. I am founder of Movement Rehab and Performance, and Dr. Tanner Melnick, PT, running specialist, and sharer of knowledge relating to running, all things running. So let's go from the top here. So I had a test a couple weeks ago now, and we'll go into the details of that, but it was a full-on put a face mask on, go through a protocol, get my heart rate up, until on a treadmill and run following a protocol until I kind of hit the red zone, couldn't go anymore. And what that left us with is data. And so whenever that happens, Tanner puts together a report. And what I'm going to do now, kind of in a live recorded sort of way, because we actually haven't totally dug into the details. So I had to leave Seattle and haven't gone back to it. So let's talk me through this here. So what's the active metabolic report? What are we looking at here?
Absolutely. So the first page is kind of like the big overview page. So it just has a couple values listed. And if anything, everything that follows this is more detailed, just to kind of give you some more information if you really want to dive into it. But if you were just looking superficial and you just want the most important numbers, kind of that's what this page is giving you. So you have listed here VT1, VT2, the heart rate peak, and then the VO2 peak. So starting with VT1, in other words, say that again.
VT means?
VT means ventilatory, and then threshold is the T. So the VT1 is essentially the top end of what's going to correlate with zone 2, or also known as like aerobic threshold is another name for this. So above this, you are starting to use some anaerobic or non-oxygen energy systems to generate energy. But if you stay below this value, you're essentially working entirely aerobic in terms of your energy systems. And then VT2 is basically the next kind of like big milestone in terms of training, and that's your ventilatory threshold 2, also known as anaerobic threshold, lactate threshold. Like all these kind of names essentially mean the same thing. They're kind of trying to indicate the same level of intensity in terms of metabolically what's going on. And so this correlates with the top end of zone 4 in a 5-zone system. And once you kind of cross that, you're into your just absolute max kind of effort level. And these two numbers are going to be, I'd say, the most important two numbers as far as your training goes, because oftentimes you're going to want to be sticking in zone 2, so you don't want to go above that VT1 number. And then the same is going to be true for VT2. You're going to do a lot of kind of zone 4 training in the big picture, in terms of your intervals, or like your harder effort stuff is usually going to be just below this number, or maybe you have a couple of really fast zone 5s, but that's essentially all out effort anyway. So it's not as important to like, I need to be looking at my, my watch or whatever. Like I need to make sure I'm above that number. It's like, you're just going all out for the most part. So it's more just effort based at that point anyway, but it gives you an idea, especially when you're doing that zone 4 training, of like, what's my top end? What do I need to stay below? Next, we have the heart rate peak. Now, the one caveat to this is, while this is a max effort test, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to achieve your absolute peak heart rate, your absolute max heart rate. While that may happen, and certainly I've seen people that it does correlate with what I would expect their kind of max heart rate to be. Other people, because it is a ramp test, sometimes people will not necessarily achieve that. So it's kind of a caveat, but we can only, report the data that we get. So if that's the highest number that you achieve, that's the highest number you achieve. But certainly with those people that I anticipate, they likely have a higher heart rate max, or that they know, if a relatively accurate heart rate monitor or chest strap, something that they've achieved a higher heart rate, then I always kind of put that into context. And then the last number there, the VO2, it's kind of like people that are more superficially kind of on the endurance spectrum. They're like, if they don't know one number, it's like, oh, this VO2 number is kind of like thrown out there like it's some like, really special thing. And it is important. I'm not downplaying that, but oftentimes it gets misconstrued that it's like the end all be all, like, oh, my VO2's fill in the blank, I'm amazing athlete. It's like, well, no, not necessarily true. But people like to see it, and it does give you an idea of kind of where you're stacking up in terms of the general populace and people your age and et cetera. So it's something to be mindful of, but not to kind of put all your weight into just that number.
So the VO2 is the highest volume of oxygen per body weight per minute consumed during this specific test. So this is really literally how much oxygen, which is going to be a fuel source, how fast can you consume that, assuming that we're going to be utilizing that to give us momentum. So the simplest way is like the higher the VO2, the more potential for performance.
Yes, potential is the exact word. And a lot of it goes down, and there've been studies on extremely high level athletes where looking at cross country skiers, cyclists, runners, those kind of high aerobic sports, and they'll have people that are pushing 70, 80, upwards of 90 in terms of this number. And just because if you take two people that have this high level that have the same VO2 does not mean that like the one that has one more is going to outperform. Like it doesn't work that way. Again, it ultimately is a potential because you're using oxygen primarily for these endurance-based sports. So if you can consume more or you can take more in, then you have the potential to be more output, basically more energy efficient. You can work at higher outloads, things like that. But the thing that's tricky about this is there's a lot of other factors that go into your ultimate performance than just this number. So you can take more oxygen in, but it doesn't mean that your body's necessarily using it as efficiently as the person next to you. So kind of, it's a good number to know, and it's a good number to track long term because it will, or it should improve with training if you're doing so in an efficient manner. So especially per individual, it's a good number to kind of track over time, especially if you have been pushing your training a little bit harder. You can kind of see the benefits. Not only the zones should reflect that, but you should also see the VO2 increase hopefully as well. But just understand that with age, it will go down, just part of life. So we understand that if you're 30 and you measure yourself at 30 and then you measure yourself at 35 and you feel like you're in much better physical shape, that may be true and it may not be reflected in VO2. It may. But as you age, it's going to go down. So you kind of have to understand the variables as well there, that you may be better, in your performance, but your VO2 may still slightly come down. And that just can be due to efficiency in training and efficiency in your heart rate zones, things like that as well. So
We'll also do a second talk here at some point. I'm reading a book on staying competitive for 50-plus-year-olds, and it's endurance sport specific. I think it's written by Joe Friel, one of the godfathers of endurance training, and I think that was the author. But in any case, it is interesting how that does change with age, but it is absolutely trainable through old age, and the benefits of doing consistent high intensity training, which the speed. Again, we're not talking speed, but we're talking like effort, like that really high efforts put in should be a lifelong endeavor. But before we go there, let's talk a little bit. So my VT1 is 132 beats a minute. So if I stay, that's the top end. So if I stay a little bit shy of that and invest time in that zone when I'm doing running or cycling, that is going to build. What's that going to do for me?
Yeah, so it's really doing a couple of things. So you can think about, and we'll get a little bit more specific here in a second when we look at the exact parameters of the zones. But staying below that number, and close to it, but below that number, It's going to put you in that zone 2 number, like I mentioned earlier. And what the zone 2 training is really doing for you is doing a few things. So one, it's basically laying the groundwork at the base for all your aerobic kind of exercise that you're going to do later on. So uh, because the aerobic energy systems, the processing for the energy takes place in the mitochondria, in the muscles that are being used to power your movement. And so with that understanding that if you are able to have more mitochondria in a given area in a muscle, that you'll be able to basically produce more energy because you have more cells to generate that energy processes. So that's the first thing, is you'll get more mitochondria density by training in that zone. And then you'll also get more what's called capillarization, or basically you'll be able to deliver more blood, which in this case means oxygen. So you'll be able to deliver more oxygen, which is going to be used to help produce the energy into the muscles, into the mitochondria. So both of those things are going to happen predominantly by training in zone 2. So those are kind of like, you need that to be able to do anything above that. And then the second thing that kind of goes along with that is it does kind of help to balance out your training load. So it's something that it's not necessarily measurable yet. We're getting much better at having like metrics to guide how much workload we're essentially putting on our bodies. And this is particularly prevalent for people that are doing more impact related activities. So your running is going to be more impacted by this just due to the forces that are generated. Cycling a little bit less so, because obviously you're not dealing with those same level forces, but still it's important to think about. But it's a way to kind of manage your loading while still maximizing your benefits as far as fitness and performance go, and trying to avoid injury risk essentially. So both those things are going to be achieved by a lot of zone 2 training, essentially staying below that VT1 number.
So in a nutshell, investing in zone 2, and the 80-20 rule I've heard for people who are really trying to push their capacity in any endurance sports, where about 80%, which I think for those of us that are kind of the weekend warriors and play around, that seems like a hard thing to do, because like, man, I don't have that much time to really do. So this not necessarily blanket for everybody, but generally speaking, if I'm thinking, hey, I really want to change my performance over time, and I can, do 5+ hours a week or something, if I did a significant portion of that in this zone 2, I am creating energy sources, these mitochondria, literally mitochondria in my muscles are going to be producing work. And so those are going to be potential horsepower, which I'm going to feed also by growing capillaries, like literally growing, the fuel source, the hose to hook up to the engine. And to finish the equation is the volume of oxygen, right? So if I'm like consuming oxygen well, I've got a nice capillary that's going to send that oxygen to the mitochondria, which is the horsepower that can keep me going for as long as I need to. Is that the should some sort of creative person could make a visual on that, but that's kind of it, right? I mean, that's kind of like that's the investment, right?
That's like the easiest, kind of most simplistic way to describe, essentially how you're powering your body to be able to continue to perform exercise. Yeah, exactly right.
So we'll put more of this detail like in a blog post, so people could kind of see what zones my specific numbers were. But I think if you could summarize with the results that I have here, and my self-described, like I've always been an endurance athlete. I used to race a long time ago, but you got on a road bike, took some time off of that, still kind of ran a little, did some running. Now I'm doing mountain biking, and actually the closest thing to proper training I've done in a long time, actually, more recently kind of getting back back on the horse, so to speak. So knowing my VT1, knowing my zones, knowing that I'm a former elite, but now kind of an intermediate level, but kind of like progressing back up. Was there any like low-hanging fruit you'd be like, you know what, you should probably focus, where would I focus my energy if I'm on the bike 8 hours a week, 7 or 8 hours a week?
Yeah, totally. And I'm glad you bring that up, because thinking about like weekend warriors or time commitment is definitely important in training. And I don't mean that like, you know, it's only worth training if you can commit 10 hours a week. Like that's not true, but definitely the more time you have available to commit, the more potential benefit that you will see. And, the even I'd say the more importance is that I would place on being really specific with my training. If you only have an hour or two to commit to training a week, like yes, you can get really dialed and really specific with, okay, I need to nail my zone two. I need to, but like it's probably not enough training to really maximize these benefits in the first place. So just getting out and doing something is probably going to be your best, best option for you. But if you do have more time to commit and you're looking to get more serious, then definitely getting more specific as far as hitting your numbers and hitting your zones is going to be kind of the best thing for you. And so kind of mentioning that 80-20 model. So most people, even the most elite level endurance athletes that have been training for years, kind of following these parameters and are dialed and know exactly kind of what their zones are, they're still going to follow the same methodology. They're still going to be in that 80-20 zone. And so if you're thinking about, I have 10 hours a week, I have 8 hours a week, whatever it is, you're going to be spending most of that time. Most of those hours are going to be spent in this zone too. That's just the way it is. It's just simple. Like you need to basically just continually maintain that base, even when it's been built out. It doesn't mean you can just forget about it and it's good and I don't need to do anything. Like it still needs constant replenishing, and then sprinkling in that zone 4, that zone 5, and then the trickier one, depending on what your goals are, kind of big picture. Like if you're training for a specific race or what have you, that's where you're going to start to get into more of the zone 3 potentially, just understanding kind of what the purpose of that zone is and how it correlates with racing and intensity, and all those factors are a little bit fluid, and it very much depends on your personal goals. But thinking like mostly zone 4, or excuse me, mostly zone 2 with a little bit of zone 4 sprinkled in is going to be a good formula kind of regardless of the person. And then from there, depending on what your goals are and kind of the specifics of your races or whatnot, you can kind of mix in some other stuff. But kind of having that general block, that 80-20 block split between zone 2 and then zone 4 is a good place to start.
Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts exactly. So I will utilize my fairly recently purchased data collection device for my mountain biking, and I got my heart rate monitor strap, and so I'm kind of getting dialed in and investing. Even as I tell some of my athletes, if you're gonna, for me, the mountain biking world, like it's a lot of group rides. It's like it's a very social part of it, but arriving early and knocking out 30 minutes on your own, like that little bit, and then going to play, like that is money in the bank, right? If you can kind of just like those 20-minute blocks, 30-minute blocks here and there, the payoff is real.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's tricky. I'm glad you mentioned the group rides, because it can be really tricky when you're training with other people, a community, unless you're all like dialed and you're like all in this, like we are all the same. We are, which is so rare. It's going to be really tricky especially to bank that zone 2 time to get enough of that for it to really be worthwhile. Because oftentimes what happens when people get together, and this is true for most, like even though we say zone 2 is like easy, people typically don't like to do what feels easy because it is easy. They like to be in that like, this is a little bit hard, but it feels like I'm working, like it feels like I'm doing something. I'm working out. And that usually is going to put you in zone 3, which is kind of the gray zone. It's not bad. Like I said, there's time and place for zone 3, but just in terms of spending most of your time there, we don't really want to have that take place. And that's where most people in a group environment especially are going to end up. So in that scenario, getting that 20-30 minutes beforehand is huge to kind of build up that base, and then you can have your fun time. And it's not necessarily the most important that you maximize every single second that you're on the bike in this case, but definitely getting that early time is good.
Yeah. So for those of us that aren't paying the bills by winning races, it is that balance of what's sustainable for me. I want to see friends. I want to go hang out. I want to, bang around a little bit, but I also still want to get better. So it's that finessing and being okay with, it's not going to be 80-20, but even if it was, again, compared to the typical, even if it was 50-50, it would be amazing for most people. If you spend 40 to 50% of your time in zone 2, and at least I'll speak for the mountain biking community, like most people right now, if they're in zone 2, it's just purely on accident as they're heading up to zone 3 and 4, and then it's just like go time. Which again isn't bad, and if it's fun, great. But I think getting people to adjust expectations, like it's hard to expect to get a lot better if that's, if you're starting from scratch, definitely you'll get better. But then that's going to plateau at some point, and you're going to be in that moderate suffering, generally uncomfortable, not improving. So, and if you're like good enough, then that's perfect. Don't change a thing. But if you have that itch for like, man, I wish I could keep up a little bit longer or go with that other group or increase my time or something like that, then I think it's worth like, getting the numbers, getting a report, knowing your zones, and guessing a little bit of that. So cool. Well, thanks for that overview. We will have a blog that's associated with this with some more detail, and we'll probably have a few follow-ups too. We can dig deeper. And if anybody who's watching this has questions, ask them away. We love talking about this stuff.